Now we turn to more spiritual matters. Kathleen Holscher was named chair of Roman Catholic Studies last year at the University of New Mexico, and this Sunday she will give a talk about Pope Francis. Why has he captured the interest of so many people? NMIF producer Megan Kamerick sat down with Holscher to talk about the religious leader who Rush Limbaugh called a Marxist and who recently graced the cover of Rolling Stone magazine.
Kathleen Holscher, thank you for joining us on New Mexico in Focus. So you're giving a talk on Pope Francis.
I am.
At the Catholic Church and the American Imagination on February 9th, this Sunday, and it's through the Albuquerque International Association. Now, Francis, as you know, was on the cover of Rolling Stone.
Yes.
Dubbed the cool Pope. Why has Pope Francis really captured the American imagination like that? I don't know if a Pope has ever been on Rolling Stone.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I'm trying to sort through. I'm a historian, and I'm really not used to trying to make sense of things that are happening as we speak. I usually have
History in the making.
I usually have the sort of historical distance that I use to process things. But I can't help but ask that question, and I think that the answer is different depending on the group of Americans that we're talking about. And I think that what I'm trying to do as I put together this talk is I'm trying to think about a few different, and I'm generalizing a little bit, but a few different kinds of Americans. You know, I'm thinking about a sort of group that I call Catholic critics, who are people who feel a sense of loyalty to the church, but are also critical about either different public positions the church holds or different ways the church governs. And I think the answer is one answer for them, and I think it's a different answer when you come to young people that may have sympathy with the Catholic Church, young people that may have sympathy with other kinds of Christianity. I think that there are things about this Pope that appeal to young people with sympathies toward evangelicalism.
Oh,
so I think, you know, and then that's another group, and then, you know, we could also talk about sort of people who have sort of left political leanings in this country and why he piques their imagination. So I'm trying to sort of parse the different populations that he appeals to.
It's good to remind people that there's a lot of different people who fall under that tent of the church. You know, we're hearing stories about him sneaking out of the Vatican to feed the poor, presenting maybe a kinder face to the gay community, you know, paying his own hotel bills, living in a modest apartment. Do you think people are possibly ascribing some things to him that are more hopeful than reality, or is it too soon?
I think it was John Allen, who's a Vatican analyst, talked about the tone versus the substance of his papacy, and this is something that a lot of people have been trying to work out, right? So he's not changing doctrine. He doesn't look like he's giving no indications he will change doctrine. But what he's doing is he's shifting tone, right? He's shifting tone, and he's doing that in many different ways. He's doing that by the kind of life he lives himself. He's doing that by sort of snippets of phrases that come out and are sort of circulated in the media. He's doing that by the images of him that we see being circulated through social media. And, you know, some people say, okay, well, what does that all mean? You know, what is that worth if he's not going to change doctrine, if he's not going to change the church's teachings on X, Y, and Z? And I think it's actually worth a lot. I mean, I think there is reason to be hopeful because in my mind, you know, the images that he presents are what, you know, people who are inside Catholic circles call the sort of pastoral sort of dimension of the papacy, what translates how the papacy sort of presents the teachings of the church to the world. And it's presenting the teachings of the church in a very different way. And
let's talk about Evangelii Gaudium, the Joy of the Gospel. This came out in November. This has put him in the sights of people like Rush Limbaugh because he critiques the culture of prosperity, quote, that deadens us to the miseries of the poor. How should we weigh the significance of this document?
I mean, I think it has intense significance because that is, I mean, and it's not in terms of church teaching, it's not new. The church, there was an encyclical called Rerum Novarum from the 1890s that said a lot of this stuff. So this stuff has been around for well over a century, but the fact that he's placing it at the forefront of the church's message means that when Catholics who are out and about in the public sphere sort of do their business, they're going to have that sort of in their mind's eye, right? They're going to have that as something that they can sort of talk about as being a priority, not only for themselves but for the church. So I think it makes a huge difference.
And you spoke that, as you say, he's given no indication of changing his stance on things like, for instance, ordaining women as priests, but recently he went out of his way to discuss the need for more responsibilities for women in the church. So what do you take from that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that, again, I mean, it comes down to, you know, when people are sort of living in their own parish communities and making decisions in their own parish communities, even though he hasn't changed church teaching, they can take those statements, right? They can take those statements and they can hold on to those statements and they can use them as points of inspiration and they can use them as points to talk from and to advocate from, right? So yeah, I think even though church teaching is not changing, I mean, I think that those statements themselves are resources that people can use to energize and to sort of reimagine their own positions within the church.
And just quickly, as we're almost out of time, given that the church remains overwhelmingly male, even patriarchal, why have you as a woman decided to focus your scholarship?
I mean,
quick answer.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I mean, I have a sort of, you know, I have a sort of insider-outsider perspective, I think, when it comes to the Catholic Church. I'm deeply sympathetic to it, but I'm also critical. And I think that position, I mean, when I teach my classes, I ask my students to try to find a position of critical empathy in regard to the things that we're studying. We want to be able to imagine people, religious people, we want to be able to step inside their shoes and feel things as they feel them and see the world as they see them, but we also want a little bit of distance. We also want a little bit of distance so that we can sort of maybe notice things that people who are wrapped up in the middle of it can't notice, right? A little bit of critical distance. And I think that, I hope that I have that when it comes to the subject that I've chosen to study.
Well, Kathleen, thank you so much for joining us to talk about this.